Okay, let's unpack this. You've brought us, well, quite a stack of sources, articles, some research, and actually some really interesting personal accounts.
Hmm.
And they all seem to be pointing towards this uh, fascinating trend, a noticeable increase in U.S. citizens seriously looking into and sometimes actually planning a move to Europe. It feels like it's shifted,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
just talk to something more solid for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely seeing that in the material.
So our mission really in this deep dive is to go through your material, the things you've gathered, and pull out the key insights. We want to understand what's driving this, especially since the sources often link it to recent political events, and then really get into the nuts and bolts, the actual reality of making such a big move.
And what jumps out immediately looking at these sources is that the reasons are, well, they're layered. People aren't shy about stating them. You hear about this deep frustration with polarizing U.S. politics, the cost of living, which just keeps climbing, safety worries like gun violence, and of course, the huge expense of healthcare. Those seem to be the big immediate triggers.
That political angle is definitely strong in the material you found. Several sources point right at Donald Trump's politics, described as polarizing and populist, as a key reason people started really thinking about leaving.
Mm.
Especially, it seems, after his reelection kind of catalyzed things for some.
Yes, it's mentioned frequently as a major push factor. But like you said, economics are right up there too. The sources really highlight the appeal of Europe potentially having a lower cost of living.
Right.
And this seems especially relevant for people worried about economic uncertainty, which one source even tied to, potential tariff impacts.
And the healthcare difference, wow, that comes up again and again in the sources. Comparing expensive U.S. healthcare with access to more affordable, sometimes universal systems in Europe, it's a massive draw.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, the material connects this worry directly to talk about potential cuts to U.S. healthcare spending. It just creates such a stark contrast, doesn't it?
It really does. And then beyond the money and politics, safety comes up as another really critical driver for some people.
Yeah, you see that in personal stories.
Exactly. The sources mention Christian, who talks about feeling safer in Portugal and the Netherlands, and Wendy Newman, who apparently felt safer in London. It's not just numbers, it's about, feeling secure day to day.
And that feeling seems to broaden out to the general social vibe, too. Worries about potentially stricter immigration policies, deportations under certain administrations, those are cited as push factors.
Mm-hmm.
Christian also mentioned just a general sense of divisiveness in the U.S. that made things feel less stable for her.
And Clayton adds another dimension there. He suggests that the overall background environment, as he puts it in the U.S., might be pushing academics and students to look elsewhere for opportunities. So it's not just one thing, but the whole climate influencing future plans.
Which leads to this really interesting idea that the sources kind of float. Is the classic American dream still seen as something you can only find or even want in the U.S.?
No.
They suggest that for some people, the U.S. just doesn't feel like home anymore, or the place where they can achieve that dream. And maybe, just maybe, the new American dream actually involves living abroad.
That's quite a shift, isn't it? And the sources point to concrete opportunities people see overseas, things like starting businesses. Kristen mentioned restaurants or bars, maybe things that felt too expensive or, face potential discrimination here.
A different kind of opportunity.
Exactly. Europe maybe offers a different path for some entrepreneurs, and young remote workers are definitely singled out as being drawn by those flexible visa options popping up.
So let's talk about the who and where. Who exactly is thinking about this, based on your sources, and where are they looking? You mentioned those young remote workers.
Yeah, they're definitely a key group mentioned. Clayton also notes that because of the transactional costs, basically, all the money and hassle involved in moving it might be more doable for, say, the upper middle class, or maybe for employees who are really in demand, whose companies might even help out. Business owners, too, they seem to have more options.
And connecting back to Clayton's point about education academics and students, especially from wealthier families, are apparently looking outside the U.S., partly because of visa issues, partly that general environment he talked about.
And destination-wise, the sources get pretty specific. We're talking UK, Ireland, France, Italy, Portugal, Switzerland, Germany, Spain. Those names come up a lot.
And there are some numbers in the sources that really make you sit up. UK citizenship applications apparently jumped 40% in just the last 2 months of 2024.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah. And Irish passport applications from U.S. citizens, up 60% since January compared to the same time last year. Plus, visa applications to France and Italy are reportedly up too.
It shows real movement. And Ariel, the financial planner mentioned in the sources, she identified specific hotspots, places like Italy, Germany, France, Spain, and Portugal. She notes that countries offering, tax breaks or special visas, Spain's remote work visa, as an example, are really popular.
And you can't ignore pop culture, apparently. The sources even threw in a mention of the Emily in Paris effect, maybe driving a bit of interest towards France. A bit lighter, but perhaps part of the mix.
Maybe so. Okay, so we've got the why, which is powerful, and the who and where. But now this is where the sources really bring things back down to earth. The how, actually doing this. It's painted as, well, far from easy.
Definitely not just grabbing your passport and laptop, is it?
Yeah.
That relocation platform, Relocate Me, that's cited, it highlights some big hurdles. Potential job shortages in Europe, maybe even lower salaries than you'd expect coming from the U.S.
But maybe the biggest, most complicated challenge, the one Clayton really goes into detail on, is U.S. taxes. This is so, so crucial for anyone listening who's considering this. The sources just hammer this home. The U.S. taxes its citizens on their worldwide income. Doesn't matter where you live. It's basically just the U.S. and Eritrea that do this.
That's incredible. So, unlike almost everyone else, if you're a U.S. citizen living in, say, France, you still have to deal with the IRS back home. It just adds this massive layer of complexity.
A huge layer. And it's not just income tax. The sources really stress the need to file that foreign bank account, report the FBAR. You have to report your foreign accounts. And if you don't, even if it's an accident, the penalties can be, as they put it, very large. It's a serious compliance thing most people just aren't aware of.
On top of that, you could end up being a tax resident in both places. In the European country and the U.S., the sources explain that, yeah, there are tax treaties and credits to avoid straight-up double taxation on the same dollar, but you'll probably end up paying whichever country's rate is higher on different types of income. It's not simple subtraction.
No, not at all. And Clayton makes the point that the U.S. and European tax systems just aren't congruent. They don't match up neatly how they define income, what deductions you can take. Even the tax years might differ. It makes everything incredibly complex, like trying to fit, square pegs in round holes constantly.
So all this complexity means you absolutely have to plan meticulously. And the sources say it takes time. Clayton advises, just from the tax angle, if you're starting cold, you need at least minimum 90 days of focused planning just to sort things out.
And that planning means getting a full picture of your finances, a worldwide balance sheet, essentially so you know what taxes you might face. And you absolutely need professional help. The sources are clear. Get advisors in the U.S. and in the European country you're aiming for. You need both perspectives.
And then there are the immigration and work hurdles we sort of touched on. The sources confirm it,
Right.
that dream of just, working from a cafe anywhere. Not really how it works legally.
No, you need the right visa, the legal permission to work there, even if it's remotely for a U.S. company. And Clayton brings up another key thing. Even if you sort out your visa or have the money to live there, your employer back in the U.S. might say no. They might not want the hassle, the transactional costs, or the legal responsibility of having an employee based overseas. They have compliance rules too.
Wow, so many hoops to jump through. And beyond all the paperwork, there's the huge piece of just adjusting culturally. Ariel, from the sources, gives some really vital advice here based on her work.
Yeah. What's that?
Get your U.S. passport first, obviously, but then spend real time traveling. Explore different European countries before you even think about picking one to move to.
That makes so much sense because, as Ariel points out, Italy feels completely different from Germany, which feels different from Portugal. You have to find a place whose culture actually fits your personality, your family.
She gives some great examples of that potential culture shock, like seeing tiny kids, maybe 4 years old, walking to school by themselves in Europe.
Whoa.
Yeah. Compare that to the U.S. obsession with carpools and school buses. Or she mentioned kids maybe having forest days at school involving things like, well, knives or supervised fires, stuff that would cause a major panic here. It just shows a fundamentally different approach to things like independence and risk.
That really paints a picture. And Christian's story, it backs up the importance of actually connecting with the community. She talked about getting locked out early on and needing help from a neighbor. That simple thing showed her a different kind of social connection, how important finding your people is.
Talking about those personal stories, the sources really capture some powerful moments. Ariel described this sudden, desperate flood of calls to her financial planning business right after the election results, like 30 calls in a week. She said it felt like 3 years' worth of business compressed. It just shows how intense and immediate the reaction was for some.
That's really telling. And Christian's journey sounds like it was very deliberate. She did a lot of planning, right? Even looked at New Zealand at first.
Yeah, but decided she wanted to be, reasonably close to family back in the States. She talked about finding safety, a sense of peace in Portugal and the Netherlands, and importantly, feeling welcomed as an immigrant. She contrasted that with how immigrants are sometimes discussed in the U.S.
That's a powerful point.
She found community, and she was even able to retire early, partly thanks to Portugal having this retirement visa that wasn't tied to a specific age.
Interesting. And Clayton's points about the extra difficulties for high net worth families, especially if student visas get revoked and mess up tax residency, it just shows how layered this is depending on your situation.
Definitely. And Christian's experience really highlights that it's rarely just one person's decision.
Hmm.
Her daughter, her mother, they were big parts of her thinking process. You have to consider the whole family.
Absolutely. So the big question then, is this trend just a temporary reaction, a blip, or is it something more lasting? Sources seem to wrestle with that.
Yeah, their take seems to be that, look, searches for moving abroad often spike after U.S. elections. But what feels different this time, according to the material, is that more people seem to be taking actual concrete steps. It's moving beyond just Googling.
So the sources kind of lay out two possible paths forward for this trend. For some people, it might be more of a short-term thing. Maybe, a career break using one of those digital nomad visas for a year or two.
Right, like an extended sabbatical.
Exactly. But for others, the sources suggest it's a much longer-term vision, maybe even a permanent move. Really looking for that new American dream we talked about, but finding it outside the U.S.
And the sources note that the increase we're seeing now is in people actually moving, not yet in huge numbers,
Yeah.
formally giving up U.S. citizenship.
Right, renunciation is a whole other level.
And they caution there's a lag in that data anyway. We won't really get a clear picture on citizenship renunciations until they estimate about 18 months from now. So maybe early 2027.
Good point. So for anyone listening who's, feeling drawn to this idea, maybe just curious, the sources offer some pretty clear, practical takeaways based on all these experiences.
First off, echoing Ariel. Get your U.S. passport sorted. That's step one. Seems obvious, but it's foundational.
Then travel. Like Ariel stressed, really travel and explore Europe properly. Find the culture that actually fits you before you commit to anything major. Don't just pick based on, photos online.
And Christian's advice really resonates. Find a community.
Yeah.
Connect with people, whether it's online groups, expats already there, locals. Don't try and navigate this huge change all alone, especially if you're the first in your circle to do it.
And crucially, absolutely crucially, as both Clayton and Ariel hammered home, do your homework on the taxes. Deeply research and understand how it works in the U.S. and in the country you're looking at. This needs serious planning, especially if you own a business or have investments. Don't underestimate this part.
For sure. And finally, just methodically think through all the practical stuff. Family, work, healthcare, housing, maybe learning a language. All the pieces involved in actually putting down roots somewhere new.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider.
So this deep dive into the sources you brought us, it's really laid out these compelling reasons why some Americans are looking eastward. Politics, economics, safety, maybe just searching for a different kind of life opportunity. We've seen who's thinking about it, the places getting attention, and importantly, the very real, often complex challenges involved. Taxes, immigration, culture shock. It's significant.
It really is. It seems like a decision often driven by some powerful personal feelings, but one that definitely demands navigating some pretty major logistical and financial hurdles, as the material makes clear.
And maybe this whole trend, looking at it through the lens of these sources, it pushes us to ask a broader question, not just about moving, but about what that whole idea of the American dream even means today. And whether, as some of these stories suggest, pursuing it might, for some people, actually mean looking beyond America's borders now.